You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs. Today, my guest is Anand Taneja. He's the assistant professor of religious studies, part of Islamic traditions of South Asia, and all this is located at Vanderbilt University. So, Anand, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to it.
Yeah, tell me about your work in the classroom and your research work. What are you focused on specifically?
So I guess you could say I work on very broadly on the question of religion and ethics. More specifically, I wrote a book called Genealogy, which is about jinns, about spirits, but really it is about how Hindus and Muslims, people from different religious traditions, go to a Muslim saint shrine and how the shrine helps in their healing psychologically, among other things. And right now I'm writing a book and researching, what Muslim minority ethical life looks like when confronted by, majoritarian nationalism. In this case, in India, Hindu nationalism. So those are kind of the broad things I work on.
Oh, so what have you seen as the dynamic between Hinduism and the Muslim faith? Do they tend to have conflict? Do they get along, or what is it like?
So in my first book, I worked on a shrine space, right? So this is a Muslim shrine space, and these are called dargahs, and they are found all through India. Usually, these shrine spaces come up around the grave, the consecrated grave of a Muslim saint. And at these shrine spaces, you actually see some remarkable interactions between Hindus and Muslims, right? So there are people who come from obviously very different theologies, but in these spaces, they actually, through these very interesting processes of translation, right, which are not just about translating text, but about translating ideas in like ways, people actually get along very well. And those processes of translation into a somewhat strange and different culture and, religious idea actually helps people kind of reformulate their identities, right? But also increasingly we've seen, so at one level, right, at one popular level, Hinduism and Islam get along really well, and that's been happening for centuries. But at another level, as religion has increasingly become important for political identity, which is something that starts happening in British colonial times, you've also seen an increasing amount of violence between communities and kind of a hard boundary drawing, which, has, among other things, led to the partition of India and Pakistan. In India, things have gotten much worse in the last few years, partly because we have a Hindu nationalist party in power in India, which kind of actively promotes Islamophobia. So that's made relations between religions much more tense. So,
what are the issues that come up? Like, why is, like you said, there's Islamophobia that is demonized, for instance, what is it that's being demonized? What is the party saying in India that's negative towards Muslims? How are they creating this Islamophobia? What have you observed?
So they will, one of the things that led to, and this is an old trope that's been recycled, is, Muslims eat beef and they're cow killers, which is something, Hindus hold the cow sacred. So there's a lot of mobilization around the figure of the Muslim as meat eater, and particularly an eater of cows, which has actually led to Muslims being lynched. The first such prominent lynching happened in 2015 on the pretext that someone actually had beef in their fridge, which was not true. But even if it had been true, it's kind of insane that you would kill people for their choice of what they're eating. And that's been mobilized again and again. So Muslims are meat eaters. And of course, the idea that Muslims are, which is an idea that's been floating around for a long time, at least for the past 20 years, of the Muslim as terrorist. And the third factor that's been pretty intense is talking about the idea of love jihad, right? That Muslim men are seducing Hindu women to to take Hindu women away and make them Muslim and to increase the Muslim population at the expense of Hindu population growth. This is obviously a crazy conspiracy theory, but you'd be surprised at how many people take it seriously and the kinds of effects it's been having. Just this last month, a young Muslim man was beheaded because he'd had a relationship with a Hindu girl.
Crazy. What do you think has stoked this division? Like, if we go back 20, 30, 50, 100 years, has this conflict always been going on, or has it been intensifying, or maybe it's been de-intensifying? What have you observed over history?
Yeah, I mean, so over history, my sense is that the Hindu-Muslim thing, right? There's always been religious differences. There have always been people who, look askance at the other, right? But as long as there was Muslims who were ruling many parts of the subcontinent, as a minority group, they actually had an interest in maintaining peace, right, with the majority. So under Muslim rule, you actually have, particularly under the Mughal dynasty, you actually have philosophies and, what we could call political theologies of living well with difference, right, accommodating difference. And that continues to be the case till well into the 19th century. Once we have British colonial rule, we also start getting modern technologies of enumeration, right? So the census is the biggest example. Once you start counting people according to religious category, which might not necessarily have been done before, right? Because people tended to classify themselves people understood themselves to be Muslims or belonging to different Hindu groups, but that was not necessarily central to their political identity. The region they belonged to, the language they spoke, who their neighbors were. All of these things were more important as far as politics was concerned. But with the coming of census categories, which the British bring on, which classify people according to religion, you pretty soon start seeing this idea of numerical majorities and minorities, right? Muslims start seeing themselves as a minority, which, needs to protect itself. And Hindus start seeing themselves as a majority who have not been, well respected, because they haven't been ruling for the past several centuries. There's also, after the great rebellion of 1857, in which Hindus and Muslims come together against the rule of the British East India Company, the East India Company is replaced by the British Crown, but they also have an idea that Hindus and Muslims coming together is not great, right? So they use the technique of divide and conquer. And one of the ways they do that is through the creation of knowledge, right? Through a creation of India's past, in which Muslims are the oppressors and Hindus have come. The British are there to liberate Hindus from Muslim oppression. And that gains a lot of traction very fast, especially among, educated Hindu groups who are, getting preferential treatment, perhaps in the new service sectors that the British are opening up. So that's at the roots of things, in a sense. Which is not to say that this conflict is unmanageable or that everything immediately falls apart. We're talking about long during historical processes. What really kind of becomes a lingering wound is the partition of the subcontinent in 1947 into India and Pakistan.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
I don't know much about the history of it, but what, to your mind, caused it and how bad was it?
It was very bad. I mean, it's caused in a sense by there are various complicated factors at play. Essentially, it's a political negotiation between the British government, which after the Second World War wants to leave, between the Muslim League, which has been campaigning for a separate homeland, and the Indian National Congress, which has members of all faiths as part of it, but is largely seen as a Hindu party. While there are people who want different things, essentially, you could say that there's a choice between a kind of union of India in which the Muslim majority provinces have a lot more autonomy, but a more decentralized kind of federal government, or a strong central or federal government and a completely separate nation state of Pakistan. And this is a choice that, the Indian National Congress, Nehru and Gandhi, not Gandhi, but Nehru and other leaders vote for, because they see being able to control a strong central government, even if you lose the nation, even if you lose the provinces that become Pakistan, as much more important than having a weak central government and a much more provincial autonomy, right? Because they have their own ideas they don't think they'll be able to cooperate with the Muslim League, and they have their own ideas of how they want the nation to develop after this moment of colonialism. No one is quite sure how that choice is going to work out, right? People, the boundary gets drawn by Cyril Radcliffe based on maps. He's never been to India. They just hand him a bunch of maps and census data, and they're like, yeah, figure it out. You're the expert drawing the map. So it's essentially between the British, between the Congress and the Muslim League, it's essentially an ill thought out and really hurried plan. And no one is quite ready for the demographics of what follows, right? No one's ready for the levels of violence that happens once people realize that, these boundaries are going to be drawn and there's going to be a Muslim majority side and a Hindu majority side. No one's ready for the scale of violence. Nobody's ready for the scale of mass migrations that follow, right? There are caravans of millions of people crossing these newly formed borders. And what the legacy of that violence does, it's not a violence that's really been processed in either country. I can't speak so much for Pakistan, but I know in India, when people started doing research around 50 years after partition, right, in 1997, there's a book that comes out by Urvashi Butalia called The Other Side of Silence. And no one talks about the violence that happened to them, the violence they perpetrated, the violence that is essentially foundational to both those states. So what happens when the foundational moment of two countries is this act of fraternal violence on a mass scale, right? We're talking about 1 million deaths. And those are conservative estimates. And we're talking many, many more people displaced. So, and this is not, this is hand-to-hand combat, essentially. And, people using swords and knives and occasionally guns. That's the kind of legacy we have on both sides. And you have mass displacement of population, and you have neither country really having any movement to, deal with it, to deal with this trauma, right? It just becomes silent. So you can imagine the kind of impact that has. In India, even though India has a commitment to secularism and kind of goes on with that, what this has meant is that for the Muslim population in India, which is, the largest religious minority, and it's the third largest Muslim population in the world, at this point, close to 200 million people, it's meant that there's always the lingering suspicion that, they're secretly, on the side of Pakistan, or that they're a fifth column and they're more loyal to Pakistan rather than India. And that means that when things get nasty, public political opinion can turn against them very quickly. Just this week, there was a game where India was playing Pakistan in cricket, right, which is this big rivalry, and India lost. And, immediately some Kashmiri students were beaten up, and the one Muslim player in the Indian team was, predictably told, oh, you should go to Pakistan, you're playing for the Pakistanis, and all of that, and all the blame for the defeat was laid on him. So, yeah, that's kind of...
So has it just become so ingrained that people really are not even questioning, or what's happening?
So, there are people who question it, right? So, especially people who know, right, India is a plural society. So I grew up in a city, for example, where I had Muslim friends and neighbors and classmates. So for me, or someone like me who's had a similar experience to me, it's kind of a harder pill to swallow, and to think of Muslims as, others and outsiders. But in other places, right, where places where partition violence was much worse, like Delhi, the capital, Hindus and Muslims are entirely segregated. So it's easier to believe all the horrible things you hear about Muslims, right, for example. And what we've seen in recent years, right, particularly since the coming into power of the Modi government, of the BJP government, is a mass coordinated campaign of what essentially of brainwashing. I can't think of another word for it, right? So they control, the government actually with a very heavy hand controls all the media channels, right? So there is not really a sane voice of opposition, right? Among the many, you have many flavors of right wing, let's just say, in the channels that are popular, the TV channels that are popular. Along with that, new technologies of social media like WhatsApp have been used to spread massive amounts of disinformation. And we're talking about a country where people didn't even have landlines, forget computers, right? So we've gone from a country which had a small minority of people having telephones to a country where everyone has smartphones. And so people don't really have a filter to figure out what is true and what is false. And you have, the BJP's IT cell and other groups who are committed to spreading a Hindu nationalist worldview, just pumping out a lot of poison, essentially. I'd mentioned, right, that Sufi shrines are places where Hindus and Muslims come together, and they are spaces not just of communal harmony in the sense that it is places that people from different religions come together. These are places of healing. These are places of conversation between religions. So one of the things that's been kind of horrifying to see, I was subscribing to these, some of the WhatsApp groups just to see the kind of discourse that was going on, is they even vilify the history of, these Sufi saints and make them into figures of villainy rather than figures of, saintly figures, which is completely against the ethos of everything that's been happening in India for centuries. And they're doing this in order to, partly to detract from all the failures of the government. That's one thing. But they're also really committed to an Islamophobic Hindu nationalist agenda. And people don't have a filter to tell what's right and what's wrong. And, what's coming to them, people are swallowing. And this is a recent phenomena, right? It's been going on for the past 5 or 6 years. But given how quickly the technology landscape is changing, I don't know whether this is going to last a longer time, whether the effects of this are going to last beyond this. Given the relentlessness of the propaganda, I would suspect that the effects of this are going to be generational.
Well, it seems like they are generational already.
Yeah.
I mean, Pakistan, what was it, 1948 or 1947? That it was, so that's already at least 3 generations. What do you see people pushing back on the other way to unify and reunite, Hindus and Muslims? And if so, what happens to them? Or do you only see propaganda pushing of division?
No, there are a lot of people. And what's been really interesting for me when I was doing, so I was back in India for all of 2018 to look specifically at the question of how Muslims are living with all of this, right? And what was really interesting for me to see was that instead of, people are angry, there's often a sense of despair and dejection at what they're living with. But there was also so much hope and optimism in so many ways in which Muslims, particularly young Muslims, were trying to come up with, alternatives, trying to come up with ways of outreach which would make them, less strange and threatening to their neighbors, trying to come up with, political ideas of creating alliances with other marginalized groups, so that you could push back against this kind of Hindu right-wing hegemony. And, I'm thinking right now, there's a group called the Khudai Khidmatgar, right? The Servants of God. And they take their name from an organization that someone called Badshah Khan used to run in the Northwest Frontier Province, which is now in Pakistan. And, this is these are Muslims who are committed to Gandhian ideas of non-violence and who, essentially work to service. So the group Khudai Khidmatgar, the revived group Khudai Khidmatgar in India, they opened up a house called Sabka Ghar, everyone's house, in which they essentially wanted to make a co-living space where people from different religions could live together. And I've spent a lot of time in that house. And, it's really remarkable, the kinds of conversations that happen when people who are not used to being in proximity to each other have to spend time with each other and realize each other's common humanity and have deeper discussions beyond that. One of the revivers of Khudai Khidmatgar in India, Faisal Khan, he's a very religious Muslim and he's very active. He does things like he decides to go on journeys by foot or journeys by cycle to kind of promote this awareness, and he'll travel with Hindus and Muslims together. Last year, he went to the Hindu city of Mathura, where, he talked to temple priests about, his ideas, and, there was lots of interesting conversation. And one of the priests at one of these temples, Hindu temples in Mathura, gave him the permission. Oh, you can the Muslim prayer, the namaz, you can pray here. That's fine. And so, that became an interesting photo op, and people took photographs of him praying inside this temple, in the Muslim style. But then the government actually used those same photographs to essentially to criminalize that act and to say that you're spreading, communal disharmony, right? Essentially you're inciting enmity between religions by doing a Muslim prayer in a Hindu space. And he was arrested. So that's just an example to tell you of the kinds of things that are going on and the ways in which particularly where the state governments are dominated by the BJP, as in this in Mathura, which is in Uttar Pradesh. There's just a pushback against any kind of attempt towards communal harmony. One of the most interesting things that happened on a bigger scale was something called, recently in the December of 2019, the Indian Parliament passed the Citizenship Amendment Act, which for the first time introduced religious qualification into the qualification for Indian citizenship. Essentially, people who are refugees from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh can get fast-tracked for citizenship if they're Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Christian, or Parsi, right? What this excludes from the list is Muslims. And this was seen as a first step of the exclusion of Muslims from public life in India, right? First legal step. And it goes in hand with something called the National Register of Citizens that the government is also promoting, which sounds as sinister as it is, right? That you have to have paperwork to prove that you belong here, otherwise you don't.
Yeah.
Your citizenship is in question.
I've spoken to people, at least in Pakistan.
Yeah.
And they say now there's cameras everywhere. You have to have like a national ID. I mean, it's really ramped up in terms of the control and the surveillance. I don't know if that's happening in India, but I know like in Lahore in particular, as one guy I've spoken to that's told me that.
Yeah. And I mean, in India, that we don't have we don't have that ID card system yet. But if it comes in, I mean, Muslims are pretty sure that it would be used to disenfranchise them, right? Like, because if you are Muslim and if you're missing one of the papers that you need to get one of those ID cards, right? Or if you don't have the right ration card, or if you don't have the right papers for your property, then everyone else will, anyone who's not Muslim qualifies for citizenship anyway, right? They get fast tracked, but you don't. You essentially are suspect as an illegal immigrant in your own country. And whether or not they would actually be thrown, removed from the country or put into detention camps, you would be disenfranchised, right? You won't be able to vote. So all of these things, along with the lynchings I mentioned and the passing of this act, really galvanized Muslims to come out onto the streets in a whole series of, protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act. And these are not just Muslim protests, right? There were people who were other people, liberals across the religious spectrum joined them in these protests. But what was remarkable about these protests was not just that they were peaceful, but that they were really, really wonderful, creative, and inclusive. And the biggest of these protests was something called Shaheen Bagh, which was a woman-led protest, right? So the Muslim women, many of them, grandmothers and mothers of children who were arrested by the police for protesting, they just kind of occupied this highway in South Delhi and just sat down and were like, we are going to sit here till you remove this law. And they sat there for 100 days, and that became this kind of remarkable, remarkable autonomous zone where, all kinds of political speech, but also all kinds of experiments and relationships were going on, right? So you had people who'd never spoken to each other, right? Conservative Muslims and queer activists were coming together and being like, okay, we are all here together. Let's, and a lot of beautiful friendships that wouldn't have been possible anywhere else were formed in this space. So we saw a kind of so there were a lot of experiments happening at this moment of reimagining what India could be and what are the ways in which it could be an actually inclusive space, which were being led by people we don't imagine being in the leadership of things like this, right? In this case, Muslim women. Of course, all of that got shut down by COVID. I was there in early March 2020, and by late March 2020, everything had been shut down because of, the COVID lockdowns.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. What has, the reaction of India and Pakistan done to this divide over the past, 20 months? Has it gotten worse, better? Has it just kind of been pushed aside because of what's going on?
So it's hard to say. I mean, so much the lockdowns, I've been here. I haven't gone back since March 2020. So, what I have is pretty sporadic information through, phone calls and occasional, I'm reading the newspapers like everyone else, and talking to my family. The lockdowns have been really, especially in the first half of 2020, were pretty stringent in India. And it's allowed the government to tamp down on protest to a big extent. Despite this, there were huge farmers' protests that were going on in India, right? So Muslims are not the only disaffected group with the kinds of policies the government is coming up. These farmers' protests, which have essentially surrounded all of the major entry points into Delhi, have, again, are places where the opposition to the government and its policies, right? So minority groups like Muslims and Christians, Dalit groups, and farmer groups have come together. It's a kind of interesting coalition building. But because of the general lockdowns, we don't really have news of what's going on happening here. In the province of Kashmir, right, which where there's been a strong independence and secession movement from India going on for the past 30 years, the COVID lockdowns essentially have allowed the government to really, really clamp down and stop, people from going to college or any form of gathering. How things will look on the other side of this, it's hard for me to say. But for now, it's been, my sense is that COVID has been a good excuse for the government to lock down all sites of protest. Things are going on online.
That's what I was going to say. So I understand it's stifled protest, but do you sense or see that either the Indian government or the Pakistani government is using COVID as an excuse to intensify the division?
Between the India and Pakistan.
Between Muslims and Hindus, whether both in India or whether, from India to Pakistan and back.
Oh, yeah. In India, I mean, one of the first things that happened with the lockdown was just after the lockdowns began that there's a Muslim missionary group, the Tablighi Jamaat, right? The Preaching Society. I should say missionary group with caution because they don't really go out and preach to, non-Muslims. They go tell other Muslims how to be better Muslims. So to call them missionaries in that sense, not quite a good characterization. But there was a gathering of the Tablighi Jamaat that was happening in Delhi in March, just before the lockdowns. And this is a group that has an international presence, right? So people were there from different countries. And there was some COVID cases among this group, right, in this gathering. That became an occasion, and this is in March of 2020. That became a huge excuse for the media and the government basically to portray Muslims as irresponsible super spreaders, right? So Muslims already associated with eating beef and they're already seen as suspect for love jihad. Now they became literally associated as vectors of disease. And that went on for a while. That's gone on that's morphed into a campaign into Muslim economic boycotts, right? Don't buy things from Muslims. Don't get Muslims off the streets, because they're dirty. It started with COVID and it has gone on to have all of these other ramifications where Muslim presence in public is seen as problematic. Yeah, it is.
That's really bad. Really bad.
It is.
What is the dynamic of Hindus and Muslims within India versus Hindus in India and Muslims in Pakistan? Is the relationship in a weird way better because they're across a border now versus the ones that are all still in India? What do you see as the difference between the two?
Oh, well, so India and Pakistan have been to war 4 times, and that border is a hard border and one that's really difficult to cross. That being said, in diaspora communities, so when Indians and Pakistanis, for example, hang out in the United States, they get along really well, right? Most of the time, because the language is really similar, the cultures are really similar. Everyone watches Bollywood movies. So people get along, and there's also this weird nostalgia of the lost other that kind of plays into it. And, when I have been to Pakistan, I've been to Pakistan 3 times. I have always met, with amazing hospitality. And I think that is because for Muslims in Pakistan, at least, there's not the sense of, at least Muslims that I encountered with, there's not a sense of Muslims of India as this other country. It's the country often that they had to leave. But they don't see it as, existentially threatening in the same way, like in a civilizational way. They have a lot of fondness for it, because a lot of people can trace families back to India and they have fond memories of India, and they have, shrines that they're familiar with, all of these things. In India, the things are, I guess, more complicated because the relationship with Pakistan is also about the relationship with Muslims in India. So areas of Muslim concentration, what we could call Muslim ghettos in India, often tend to be called mini Pakistans. So, when I was in school, going to the toilet used to be called going to Pakistan. Like, there are all these kind of awful ways in which, the othering of Pakistan and the othering of Indian Muslims is very deeply conflated, right? And you can't really split it apart. I can't speak for minority relations in Pakistan. I believe they're not great, but then the number of Hindus and Christians in Pakistan is so much smaller as a percentage of the population than the number of Muslims in India, right? That it's a very different.
How many Muslims are estimated to be in India?
200 million approximately. They're about 14% of the population, right? So
I know it's not that easy, but who stayed versus going to Pakistan, and why? Was it just because of the geography? And, it's only the people in the Kashmir region that just naturally were pushed into Pakistan, or is there another reason why so many stayed?
Well, a lot of them stayed because, they chose to stay. They really, there's a lot of, Pakistan was a contested idea among Indian Muslims, right? Not everyone wanted a separate homeland. And that's, I think, unfortunately, the problem in the, academic study of Islam in South Asia, that we talk about Muslim separatism a lot. We talk about, the idea of the Islamic State a lot. We don't talk about many of the religious thinkers and scholars and politicians who really were committed to the idea of living in a pluralist society. In the Deoband movement, or the Deoband, one of the most kind of prominent schools of Indian Muslim thought can be linked to the seminary called Darul Uloom Deoband. And the majority of scholars from Deoband who have a significant religious leadership role among the Indian Muslim community really were committed to the idea of a pluralist India and belonging here. So there was that. A lot of people who left because they were afraid for their lives, right? So in 1947, there's just so much violence that it seems easier to get up and leave rather than to stay, right? To preserve your life. Then in the years after 47, when things have calmed down, it was harder for Muslims to get jobs in India because there was this idea that, well, they created a separate country for you, right? So why don't you, jobs are scarce, third world economy, which is trying to ramp up. Why don't you go to that other country that exists for you? So people left because of some people were committed to the idea of Pakistan, and so they left. I think a lot more people left because they were compelled to, either by violence or by, economic circumstance. And one should say by the policies of the post-colonial government in India, which often took over Muslim properties, right? There's the whole office of the custodian of enemy property, which took over a lot of Muslim properties if Muslims didn't happen to be occupying them, or if one member of the family had gone to Pakistan, gave them to Hindu and Sikh refugees who are coming from the other side. But despite all of this, many chose to stay because they wanted to, right? They really believed in the idea of an India that belonged to everybody. And a lot of young Muslims today, will say, I am Indian. My grandparents chose to stay here when they could have left. So why are you telling me that I'm not Indian?
No, I see what you mean. In India, are there enclaves where it's all Muslim? Like, have the Muslims separated themselves, or the Hindus separated themselves? And again, are there mixed areas still, or are they separated now?
So there are mixed areas, right, and there are mixed cities, but those tend to be places where essentially places remain. So in India, communities have tended to live separately, like traditionally, right? You'd have different areas of the city where different communities are organized by religion, by caste, by occupation. But as you had more modern developments, you had people from all communities moving together, living together. So, for example, like I mentioned earlier, I grew up with Hindu and Muslim friends and neighbors, right, in the houses, relatively new development that came up in the early 1980s. Cities like Bombay, again, places where there was not a lot of violence in the aftermath of partition, and where people didn't forcibly have to segregate, remained mixed. But there's a pattern in India, right, that wherever you start seeing targeted violence, people tend to congregate in areas of one community. So Muslims tend to congregate in one area primarily for safety in the aftermath of communal riots. what in India are called communal riots, or what we would call sectarian riots. So in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, you saw a series of riots in India, and particularly after the destruction of the Babri Masjid in 1992, you have a massive series of riots. And after that, you really start seeing segregation becoming kind of more and more prevalent, and areas of mixed population kind of disappearing. And that's happened in cosmopolitan cities like Bombay. That's happened in Delhi, where a lot of Delhi was seen as a relatively safe city. So a lot of Muslims left Western UP, right, the next province over, and kind of settled in an area around the Muslim university, Jamia Millia Islamia. And so you now actually have a patchwork of where you have some areas of Muslim population in all the major cities, but you have increasingly fewer areas of mixed population.
This may be a very ignorant question, but I don't know. If I went to India, would I be able to tell, oh, that's a Muslim person or that's a Hindu person? And do the people live there? Can you just tell by sight or by dress, or how do they know?
Well, it depends, right? A lot of people wear, I guess, modern Western clothes, shirts and trousers, right? So in that case, you wouldn't be able to tell. But if you ask someone their name, you would immediately be able to tell, right? So names are pretty easy markers of identity in India. But also, yeah, some Muslims tend to dress conservatively, so they'll have a long beard and, wear more traditional clothes and maybe even have a cap. That would mark someone as Muslim. But otherwise, yeah, unless it's someone who's, traditionally dressed and has the traditional beard, it's very hard to tell. Unless, you just explicitly ask people their name, then it's very easy to tell.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, all over the world throughout time, there's this same thing seems to have happened, like Israel and Palestine. Yeah. Very similar, languages similar, cultures similar, food, everything, but they fight. Hindus and Muslims, same thing. The Hutus and the Tutsis in Africa, Rwanda and stuff. I mean, it's funny, the people that are closest seem to fight the most. It's like sibling rivalry in a way. It's not, it's far worse than that, but it's just weird that it's that way,
Yeah, I think it's also like all of the examples you mentioned, Israel and Palestine, Rwanda and India and Pakistan. It's interesting that, yeah, of course, people fight, but the intensity of it gets so much worse once you have, modern forms of enumeration and ideas. Right? And I often joke about this with my students. It's kind of my dark humor moment where I say, well, the British did one partition in 1947. They did the partition of India and Pakistan. And they're like, oh, that didn't go so well. Let's try it again. And this time they did it in Israel and Palestine. Of course, that's different. There's a UN mandate, but it's still, it was a British mandate at that time. And that doesn't go so well either, right? Once you draw that line that says that, Hindus need to be on one side and Muslims need to be on the other, that line, which is so abstract, kind of has these terrifying consequences in the ways in which people relate to each other, where people who would be perfectly happy getting along with each other, at one moment are ready to kill each other genocidally the next. And they weren't doing that before those lines and that enumeration became possible. I mean, if we think of what happened in Yugoslavia, right? Once people thought of themselves as Yugoslavs, right? And as soon as you have the kind of breakup into politically separate entities, people go from thinking of each other as friends and neighbors to thinking of each other as Croats and Muslims and Serbs, and are ready to kill each other, even if they were, perfectly fine hanging out with each other the day before. So I think we have to think something about how the combination of nationalism and religion as a modern fact really contributes to genocidal violence.
Yeah, I feel like the same thing in the U.S. has been happening. It seems like the media and the government are responsible for really stoking the fuels and the political aspect, the politicization of these differing peoples wherever they are. That seems to be the poison that causes.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, governments are supposed to be bringing peace, right, and maintaining peace and law and order, but they all work through, I guess, rather than peace and law and order, they work through the management of violence, right? So you create the violence that then you manage. So
I don't know, any solutions that you think could be workable, or is it just such a mess and you don't know what's going to happen? Like, what's your thought for the future?
I mean, I think in India, the solution really is to revive the culture of which people had developed over centuries of living together with difference. And that needs investment in education, that needs promotion of that vision, which, in some ways, after 1947, the government in India, which was committed to secularism, to a small measure managed to do that, which allowed India to be, despite all its problems, a relatively stable pluralist country for quite a few years. That's gone. And we've been losing that for the past 30 years, especially since the early 1990s. And without doing that, without kind of creating a culture where, religious nationalism is not the forefront of political identity, I don't see a solution. But that needs political will, which at this point, most of the political parties in India don't have. So yeah, I'm not very optimistic. I'm hoping that, they're also if there's a grassroots movement which can kind of translate into political capital, maybe, but it's a hard road to hoe. Yeah. Hard road to hoe, I should say. Yeah.
Okay. Well, very good, Anand. What's the best way for people to find out more about your work and your thoughts? Where can they go?
You could look up my website on Vanderbilt. My name is Anand Taneja. I'm in the Department of Religious Studies, and you can read my book. It's got a pun in the title. It's called Genealogy, with the genealogy spelled with Jinn, because it's about spirits. My book is called Time, Islam, and Ecological Thought in the Medieval Ruins of Delhi. It was published by Stanford University Press in 2018. Yeah.
Very interesting. I'll have to have you back to talk about that other side of what we spoke about. But for now, again, Anand, thank you for coming, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful conversation, Richard.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.